Oklahoma Territory, 1888. Catherine Walsh pressed one hand against her swollen belly and gripped her carpet bag tighter with the other as the stagecoach lurched to a stop. Through the dusty window, she could see him waiting, tall, broad-shouldered, hat in his hands. Thomas Brennan, the man whose letters had promised her a new start, a home, a future. The man who had no idea what she was bringing to his doorstep. Her secret had grown too large to hide now. 6 months along, and the baby moved constantly, as if reminding her that time was running out. She'd worn the loosest dress she owned, had wrapped herself in a shawl despite the autumn heat. But there was no disguising the truth anymore. When he saw her, he would know. And then he would send her away, just like everyone else had. The driver opened the door, offering his hand. Catherine took a breath, gathered what little courage she had left, and stepped down into the Oklahoma dust. Thomas Brennan looked up as she emerged, and his smile froze. His blue-gray eyes dropped to her belly, then back to her face. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the snorting of the stage horses and the distant call of a meadowlark. Catherine's throat went tight. This was it, the moment where her last hope died. She opened her mouth to speak, to apologize, to beg for enough money to go back east, but no words came. Thomas stepped forward. His weathered face was unreadable, his eyes searching hers. Then he looked down at her belly again, and something shifted in his expression. Not anger, not disgust, but something gentler. Something that made her chest ache with unexpected hope. "Miss Walsh," he said quietly, and his voice was deeper than she'd imagined from his letters, rougher but somehow kind. "You've had a long journey. Let me take your bag." He reached for her carpet bag, his calloused fingers brushing hers. Catherine pulled back instinctively, clutching the bag to her chest like a shield. "Mr. Brennan, you should know." "I can see what I should know," he said, not unkindly. His gaze was steady, honest. "Question is, do you want to stay, or do you want to go back?" The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if voting. Catherine's eyes stung with sudden tears. "I want to stay," she whispered. "But I understand if you don't want, if you can't." "The father?" Thomas asked quietly. "Dead." The word came out flat, final. "He died before he knew, before I could tell him." Thomas nodded slowly, as if weighing something heavy in his mind. Then, he did something that made Catherine's breath catch. He set his hat on the porch post, stepped closer, and laid one warm, calloused hand gently on her belly. The baby kicked against his palm, and his eyes widened. "Strong," he said, and there was wonder in his voice. "Healthy, by the feel of it. Mr. Brennan." "Thomas," he corrected. His hand stayed where it was, warm and steady. "If you're staying, you'll be my wife. Might as well use my name." Catherine stared at him, not daring to believe what she was hearing. "You still want to marry me? Even knowing?" "I asked for a wife," Thomas said simply. "I asked for someone to build a life with. You answered. You came all this way, carrying that burden alone." His hand moved from her belly to cup her face, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "Takes a strong woman to do what you did. Takes courage." "I lied in my letters," Catherine said, her voice breaking. "I didn't tell you." "You survived," Thomas interrupted gently. "Whatever happened before don't matter to me. What matters is what happens now." He paused, his blue-gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her heart pound. "I'll raise him as my own. Or her. Makes no difference to me. This baby will have my name, my protection, my love. Same as you." The words broke something open inside Catherine's chest. She'd spent 6 months terrified, alone, convinced she was ruined beyond redemption. And here was this man, this stranger, who'd become her last hope, offering her everything she'd been too afraid to dream of. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do that?" Thomas's smile was sad, understanding. "Because I know what it's like to need a second chance." And because, he hesitated, then spoke with quiet conviction. "Because that's what family does. They show up. They stay. They love, even when it's hard." Catherine let out a sob and stepped into his arms. He held her carefully, as if she might break, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other resting protectively on her lower back. She could feel his heartbeat, steady and strong, and smell leather and sage and honest sweat. For the first time in months, she felt safe. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest. "Thank you." "No thanks needed," Thomas murmured into her hair. "Just promise me one thing. Anything. Promise me you'll stay. No running when things get hard. No leaving when you're scared. We're in this together now." And that means staying. Catherine pulled back just enough to look up at him. His face was serious, but not harsh, his eyes searching hers for the truth. She thought about the long journey from Boston, the shame that had driven her west, the fear that had haunted every mile. And she thought about this man, this unexpected gift of grace, offering her a home she didn't deserve. "I promise," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "I won't run." Thomas smiled then, really smiled, and it transformed his weathered face into something almost beautiful. "Then welcome home, Catherine Brennan." The name settled over her like a warm blanket. Catherine Brennan. Not Catherine Walsh, the ruined woman. Not Catherine, the unwed mother. But Catherine Brennan, wife of Thomas, mother of his child. A woman with a future instead of just a shameful past. "Home," she repeated softly, testing the word. It had been so long since she'd had one. Thomas picked up her carpet bag with one hand and offered her his other arm. "Let me show you around. House isn't much, but it's solid. I built it myself 3 years back." Catherine took his arm, feeling the strength in it, the steadiness. As they walked toward the house, the baby kicked again, and she pressed her hand to the spot. Thomas noticed and smiled. "Active little one," he observed. "Very," Catherine agreed, "especially at night." "Boy or girl? You think?" Catherine shook her head. "I don't know. Does it matter?" "Not a bit." Thomas opened the door and gestured for her to enter first. Boy means teaching him to ride and rope. Girl means teaching her the same, plus how to shoot straight and stand her ground. Either way, they'll know they're loved. The interior of the house was simple but clean. A main room with a stone fireplace. A kitchen area with a cast-iron stove. 2 doors leading to what must be bedrooms. Everything was tidy, almost Spartan. But Catherine could see the care in it. The swept floors, the dishes neatly stacked, the quilt folded precisely on the back of a chair. "It's lovely," she said honestly. Thomas looked around as if seeing it through her eyes. "It's quiet. Been too quiet, if I'm honest. I'm hoping." He paused, then continued. "I'm hoping you and the baby will fill it up with life again." Catherine set her hand on the back of a wooden chair, feeling its solidity. "I'll do my best to be a good wife. I can cook and clean and mend. I can keep a garden. I'm not completely useless, even like this." She gestured to her belly. Thomas frowned. "Catherine, you don't have to prove anything to me. You're not a hired hand. You're my wife." He stepped closer, his voice gentler. "And you're carrying a baby. That's work enough right there. Don't push yourself too hard." The kindness in his words made her throat tight again. She'd spent so long bracing for judgment, for cruelty. The gentleness felt almost foreign. "I just want to earn my place here," she said quietly. "You already have." Thomas reached out and took her hand, his thumb rubbing across her knuckles. "You got on that stage and came all this way, not knowing what you'd find. That took guts. That's all the earning I need." Catherine looked down at their joined hands, his so much larger, weathered and scarred from work, hers smaller and paler. It felt right, somehow. The fit of them. "Tell me about yourself," she said. "Your letters were kind, but they didn't say much about who you are." Thomas led her to the table and pulled out a chair for her. "Not much to tell. Born in Missouri, came out here after the war. Bought this land with my savings and started building. Got a small herd of cattle, some chickens, a couple horses. Make enough to live on. Little extra most years." "The war," Catherine repeated. "You fought?" His jaw tightened briefly. "Union cavalry. Saw more than I care to remember." He paused, then added quietly. "Lost my brother at Shiloh. Came home to find my parents had passed from fever. Didn't have much holding me in Missouri after that." "I'm sorry," Catherine said, understanding loss. "That must have been terrible." "It was," Thomas acknowledged. "But it taught me something. Life's too short to waste on hate or holding grudges. Too short to turn away someone who needs help." He looked at her meaningfully. "That's part of why I said yes to you. Even knowing. Because I remember what it's like to need a second chance." Catherine squeezed his hand. "What was your brother's name?" "Henry. He was 2 years younger than me. Always getting into trouble." Thomas smiled at the memory, sad but genuine. "He'd have liked you, I think. He always said I needed someone to keep me from being too serious." "I'll do my best," Catherine said, and was surprised to find herself almost smiling. It had been so long since she'd felt anything close to lightness. They talked for another hour, trading stories carefully, learning each other. Thomas told her about the ranch, the neighbors scattered across the territory, the small town of Red Fork about 8 miles east. Catherine shared what she could about Boston, about her father's dry goods store, about growing up near the harbor. She didn't talk about how she'd ended up pregnant and alone, and Thomas didn't ask. That kindness, that respect for her privacy, made her feel safer than any promise could have. As the sun began to set, Thomas stood and stretched. "I should show you the bedroom. You must be exhausted from the journey." Catherine followed him to one of the two doors. He opened it to reveal a small room with a large bed covered in a simple quilt, a dresser, a washstand with a pitcher and basin. The window looked out over the prairie, where the setting sun painted the grass gold and amber. "This is yours," Thomas said. "I'll take the other room." Catherine turned to look at him, confused. "But we're married. Or we will be, once we find a preacher." "We'll get to that when you're ready," Thomas said gently. "For now, you need rest and space. I'm not going to rush you into anything, Catherine. We've got time." The relief that washed over her was so strong it nearly buckled her knees. She'd been bracing herself for demands, for expectations she wasn't ready to meet. But here was Thomas, giving her exactly what she needed, without her having to ask. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded. "There's water in the pitcher. I'll bring your bag in. You take your time getting settled." After he left, Catherine stood in the middle of the small room and let herself breathe. Really breathe, for the first time in months. She was safe. The baby was safe. And the man who'd promised to protect them both seemed to actually mean it. She washed her face and hands, unpacked her few belongings into the dresser, and changed into her nightgown. By the time she climbed into bed, full darkness had fallen outside. She could hear Thomas moving around in the main room, the soft sounds of him banking the fire and preparing for sleep. The baby kicked, and Catherine laid her hand over the spot. "We're going to be all right," she whispered to the life growing inside her. "I think we're actually going to be all right." She fell asleep with those words still echoing in her mind, the first real hope she'd felt since everything had fallen apart back east. The next morning, Catherine woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. She dressed quickly in her green calico dress, looser than the burgundy traveling dress, and braided her hair. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Thomas at the stove, cooking breakfast. "Morning," he said with a smile. "Hope you slept well." "Better than I have in months," Catherine admitted. "You didn't have to cook. Figured you could use the rest." He gestured to the table. "Sit. Coffee's hot." They ate together in comfortable quiet, broken only by small exchanges. Thomas asked how she took her coffee, cream and a little sugar, which he had, and whether she liked her eggs scrambled or fried. Simple things, domestic things, but they felt significant somehow, like they were building something together, one small choice at a time. After breakfast, Thomas showed her the rest of the ranch. The small barn with its 3 horses, 2 workhorses, and a bay mare, he said, was gentle enough for her to ride. Once the baby came. The chicken coop with a dozen hens and a rooster, who eyed them both suspiciously. The vegetable garden, mostly harvested now, but still producing late squash and root vegetables. "I'm not much of a gardener," Thomas admitted. "I can keep things alive, but making them thrive is another matter." "I can help with that," Catherine said, already mentally planning what she'd plant in the spring. "Tomatoes and beans, definitely. Herbs for cooking and healing. Maybe some flowers too, just for beauty. My mother kept a wonderful garden. She taught me." "Your parents, are they still in Boston?" Catherine's smile faded. "My mother died when I was 15. My father remarried last year. His new wife didn't. She didn't want me around. The understatement was vast, but Catherine didn't elaborate. Her stepmother's fury when the pregnancy became known, her father's cold ultimatum, leave or be sent to an asylum. Those memories still burned. Thomas's jaw tightened. "That's their loss," he said firmly. "You're welcome here, Catherine. You and the baby both. Never doubt that." The days that followed fell into a rhythm that surprised Catherine with its ease. She woke each morning to find Thomas already up, often with coffee made and the fire going. They'd eat breakfast together. Then he'd head out to work with the cattle or make repairs while she tidied the house and worked on preparing for the baby. In the afternoons, they'd find themselves together more often, her mending while he fixed tack, both of them talking about nothing and everything. Thomas was teaching her about the ranch, explaining how he managed the herd, where the property lines were, which neighbors could be trusted, and which to watch carefully. He treated her like a partner, not a possession, asking her opinion on decisions and actually listening to her answers. And slowly, carefully, Catherine felt herself beginning to trust him. Not just trust that he'd keep his word about the baby, though that was part of it, but trust him with the damaged parts of herself she'd kept hidden. One evening, about a week after her arrival, they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset when the baby started moving vigorously. Catherine gasped and pressed her hand to her side. "You all right?" Thomas asked immediately, concern in his voice. "Yes, just, the baby's very active tonight." She smiled ruefully. "Sometimes it feels like there's a whole dance happening in there." "Can I?" Thomas hesitated, then gestured to her belly. "Can I feel?" Catherine's breath caught. This felt intimate in a way that even his earlier touch hadn't. But she nodded and guided his hand to the spot where the baby was kicking hardest. Thomas's eyes went wide as he felt the movement. That's incredible." His voice was full of wonder. "He's strong." "Or she," Catherine reminded him with a smile. "Or she," Thomas agreed. His hand stayed where it was, warm and gentle. "Does it hurt?" "Sometimes. Mostly it's just strange, like I'm not alone in my own body anymore." Thomas looked up at her, and something in his expression made her chest tighten. "You're not alone, Catherine. Not anymore. Not ever again, if I have anything to say about it." The words hung between them, weighted with promise. Catherine felt tears prick her eyes, but they weren't tears of fear or shame this time. They were something else, something that felt dangerously close to hope. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she whispered. "You don't owe me anything." Thomas's hand moved from her belly to cup her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. "Maybe not, but I want to be. That's the difference." He paused, then added quietly, "You're easy to be kind to, Catherine." She laughed shakily. "Most people would disagree with you." "Then most people are fools." His voice was fierce, protective. "You're brave and strong, and doing the best you can with a hard situation. That deserves kindness, not judgment." Catherine couldn't help herself. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his, closing her eyes. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I'm scared of what's coming, of the birth, of being a mother, of failing at this." "I'm scared too," Thomas confessed. "I don't know the first thing about babies, but we'll figure it out together. That's what partners do." Partners, Catherine repeated softly. She liked the sound of that. Not master and servant, not even just husband and wife, but partners. Equals. They sat like that for a long moment, foreheads pressed together, breathing in sync, the baby kicking occasionally between them. When they finally pulled apart, the sun had set completely, leaving the sky painted in purples and deep blues. "We should go in," Thomas said reluctantly. "Getting cold." But as they stood, he kept her hand in his, and Catherine didn't pull away. That night, Catherine lay in bed thinking about Thomas's words. Partners. Equals. It was so different from what she'd known before, so different from what she'd expected. The baby's father had been charming, but ultimately selfish, interested only in his own pleasure, disappearing the moment things became complicated. She'd thought that was what men were, users who took what they wanted and left the consequences for women to bear. But Thomas was showing her different. He was showing her that some men kept their promises. Some men stayed. The thought should have comforted her, but instead, it terrified her. Because if she let herself believe it, if she let herself trust him completely, and then he changed his mind or left, or proved to be like the others after all, it would destroy her. She'd barely survived the first betrayal. She wouldn't survive another. So even as she felt herself falling toward trust, falling toward something that felt dangerously like affection, Catherine held part of herself back, just in case, just to protect the battered remnants of her heart. The following week brought the first real test of their fragile peace. Thomas had mentioned they needed to ride into Red Fork for supplies, and Catherine had agreed easily enough. But when Saturday came, and they were preparing to leave, she realized with growing dread what this actually meant. "I can't go," she said suddenly, backing away from the wagon. "I'll stay here. You go." Thomas looked at her in confusion. "Catherine, it's all right. We need flour and sugar. And I thought you might want to pick out some fabric. For the baby." "No." Her voice came out sharper than she intended. "I can't. I'll stay here." Understanding dawned in Thomas's eyes. "You're worried about what people will say." Catherine wrapped her arms around herself, around her swollen belly. "They'll know. They'll see me. And they'll know I was pregnant before we married. They'll judge. They'll whisper." "Probably," Thomas agreed calmly. "People do love to gossip. But Catherine, we can't hide you away forever. You're my wife, or you will be, once Reverend Patterson comes through next month. You've got nothing to be ashamed of." "Easy for you to say," Catherine shot back. "You're not the one who'll be called names. You're not the one who'll be looked at like what?" Thomas asked gently. "Like you're human? Like you made a mistake?" "Catherine, everyone in Red Fork has made mistakes. Every single person. They've got no right to judge you. That won't stop them." Thomas stepped closer, careful not to crowd her. "You're right. It won't. But I'll be there beside you. And if anyone says a word against you, they'll have me to deal with." Catherine looked up at him, wanting to believe, but afraid to. "I don't want to bring shame on you." His expression softened. "The only thing that would shame me is if I let you face this alone. We're in this together, remember?" She did remember. She'd promised not to run, promised to stay when things got hard. And here, was the first hard thing, arriving sooner than she'd expected. "All right," she said finally. "But I'm staying close to you. Wouldn't have it any other way." The ride into Red Fork took about 90 minutes in the wagon. Catherine spent most of it silent, hands clasped tightly in her lap, anxiety building with every mile. Thomas tried to distract her with stories about the various families they'd meet, but she could barely focus on his words. When they finally rolled into town, really just a main street with a dozen buildings clustered around it, Catherine felt every eye turned toward them. The wagon wheels creaked to a stop in front of the general store, and Thomas set the brake. "Ready?" he asked quietly. No, Catherine thought, but she nodded anyway. Thomas came around to help her down, his hand steady on her arm. As her feet touched the ground, she heard it, a woman's voice. Not quite low enough. "Is that the new wife? My goodness, look at her. She must have been in the family way before she even left Boston." Catherine flinched. Thomas's jaw tightened, and he started to turn toward the speaker. But Catherine grabbed his arm. "Don't," she whispered. "Please. It'll only make it worse." Thomas looked down at her, conflict clear on his face. But he nodded and guided her toward the store entrance instead. Inside the general store, the proprietor, a balding man with spectacles, looked up from his ledger. His eyes widened slightly as he took in Catherine's condition, but his smile remained polite. "Thomas, good to see you, and this must be your bride from back east." "Catherine," Thomas said firmly. "Catherine Brennan. We need flour, sugar, coffee, and some fabric if you've got it." Of course. The proprietor bustled around, gathering items. "How are you finding the territory, Mrs. Brennan?" Catherine swallowed. "It's very beautiful. Different from Boston, but beautiful." "I expect so. City girl like yourself must find it lonely out there." "I'm not lonely," Catherine said, and realized with surprise that it was true. "Thomas is good company." The proprietor chuckled. "Well, that's good to hear." He laid out several bolts of fabric, simple cottons in various colors. "For the baby, I assume?" Catherine ran her hand over a soft yellow cotton. "Yes. The baby will be here in about 3 months." She said it clearly, deliberately, and saw the proprietor's eyes flick between her and Thomas. Calculating. But he said nothing, just nodded, and began measuring out the fabric she selected. As Thomas paid and loaded their supplies, a woman entered the store, middle-aged, stern-faced, wearing black bombazine that marked her as a widow. She stopped short when she saw Catherine, her eyes going immediately to the swell of her belly. "Thomas Brennan," she said coolly. "I heard you'd married. Quite suddenly." "Mrs. Hartwell." Thomas's voice was equally cool. "This is my wife, Catherine." Mrs. Hartwell's gaze was sharp as broken glass. "I can see that. Though I must say, it seems you married in quite a hurry." "Most couples wait at least." "Most couples aren't any of your concern," Thomas interrupted, his voice hard. "My wife and I appreciate your interest, but we've got supplies to load." Mrs. Hartwell's face flushed with indignation. "Well, I was simply making an observation." "No need to be rude, Thomas. I'm only thinking of your reputation. What people will say." "Let them say what they want," Thomas replied flatly. He took Catherine's arm. "Come on, we're done here." As they walked out, Catherine could feel Mrs. Hartwell's eyes boring into her back. Her hands shook as Thomas helped her into the wagon, and she blinked against sudden tears. "I told you," she whispered once they were moving. "I told you they'd judge." Thomas's hands were tight on the reins. "Mrs. Hartwell judges everyone. Always has. She thinks being a widow gives her the right to police the whole town." "She's not wrong, though," Catherine said quietly. "We did marry in a hurry. And I am. The baby is ours," Thomas said firmly. He glanced over at her, his expression softening. "Catherine, look at me." She turned her head, meeting his blue-gray eyes. "I don't care what Mrs. Hartwell thinks. I don't care what anyone in that town thinks. The only opinions that matter are yours and mine. And as far as I'm concerned, we're doing just fine." Catherine wanted to believe him, but the shame that had been her constant companion for months didn't disappear just because Thomas said kind words. It sat heavy in her chest, whispering that she didn't deserve his protection, his kindness, his acceptance. They rode in silence for a while. Then Thomas spoke again, his voice quieter. "When I came back from the war, people looked at me different, like I was dangerous, like I might snap at any moment." He paused. "Some of the men who came back did snap, turned to drink or violence, or just disappeared into themselves. But I didn't want that. I wanted to build something good, something clean." Catherine listened, hearing the pain beneath his words. "Point is," Thomas continued, "I know what it's like to have people judge you for something you can't change, to have them see only one piece of who you are and decide that's all you are. It's not fair, and it's not right, but it happens." He looked over at her again. "Difference is, we get to decide who we are. Not them. Us." "Who do you think I am?" Catherine asked softly. Thomas considered the question seriously. "I think you're brave. I think you've been through something hard and survived it. I think you're going to be a good mother. And I think..." He hesitated, then continued, "I think you're someone I'd like to know better. If you'll let me." Catherine's throat went tight. "I'd like that too." Something shifted between them in that moment, subtle but significant. An understanding, maybe, or the beginning of something more than just a practical arrangement. When they reached the ranch, Thomas helped her down from the wagon with extra care. "You rest," he said. "I'll unload." But Catherine shook her head. "I'll help. We're partners. Remember?" Thomas smiled. Partners. They worked together to bring the supplies inside, moving in comfortable coordination. Catherine found herself noticing small things. The way Thomas was careful not to let her lift anything heavy. How he'd positioned the fabric bolts where she could easily reach them. The way he'd bought peppermints even though she hadn't asked, because he'd noticed her looking at them in the store. Small kindnesses. But they added up to something larger. Something that made her chest ache, with feelings she wasn't quite ready to name. That evening, after a simple supper of beans and cornbread, Catherine sat by the fire with the yellow fabric in her lap, beginning to cut pieces for a baby gown. Thomas sat nearby, mending a bridle, but she could feel his eyes on her occasionally. "Will you teach me?" he asked suddenly. Catherine looked up. "Teach you what?" "How to take care of a baby. I don't know anything about it." His expression was earnest, almost vulnerable. "I want to help, but I don't know what to do." Catherine's heart squeezed. "I don't know much either," she admitted. "I've never done this before. But I can teach you what I know, and we'll figure out the rest together." "Together," Thomas repeated, and the word sounded like a promise. The weeks that followed brought changes, subtle but significant. Thomas started leaving his bedroom door open at night, and Catherine found herself doing the same. They never spoke about it, but she knew he was listening for her, making sure she was all right. And on the nights when the baby kicked particularly hard and kept her awake, she'd hear him moving in the other room, awake too, keeping watch. He asked her opinion on everything: which fields to plant in spring, whether to buy another horse, how to arrange the furniture when the baby came. And he listened to her answers, really listened, implementing her suggestions without making her feel like she was overstepping. In return, Catherine started taking care of him in small ways. She mended his shirts without being asked, learned how he liked his coffee, started cooking the meals he mentioned missing from childhood. She found herself watching for him in the afternoons, listening for the sound of his boots on the porch, feeling a warmth in her chest when he came through the door. It scared her, this growing attachment, because it felt dangerously like falling in love, and Catherine had promised herself she wouldn't be that foolish again. Love had destroyed her once already. She couldn't afford to let it destroy her again. But Thomas made it so easy to forget that promise. He was steady and kind and patient. He never pushed, never demanded, never made her feel like she owed him anything beyond what she was already giving. And slowly, despite her best efforts to protect her heart, Catherine felt her walls beginning to crumble. One afternoon in late October, Thomas came in from working with the cattle to find Catherine standing at the window, one hand pressed to her lower back, the other on her belly, her face tight with discomfort. "Catherine?" He was at her side immediately. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," she said, but her voice was strained. "Just, the baby's sitting heavy today. My back aches." Thomas looked around, then made a decision. He guided her to the chair and knelt behind it. "May I?" Catherine nodded, not sure what he intended. Then she felt his hands on her lower back, his thumbs pressing gently into the sore muscles, and she couldn't help the small sound of relief that escaped her. "That help?" Thomas asked. "Yes," Catherine breathed. "Yes, that's perfect." He worked quietly, his hands strong but gentle, easing the tension from her back. Catherine closed her eyes, letting herself sink into the sensation. It had been so long since anyone had touched her with care, with the simple intention of providing comfort. "Better?" Thomas asked after several minutes. "Much better. Thank you." Catherine opened her eyes and looked back at him over her shoulder. He was so close, his face level with hers, his eyes warm with concern. Without thinking, she reached up and touched his cheek. "You're very good to me." Thomas turned his face into her palm, his eyes closing briefly. "You make it easy." The moment stretched between them, weighted with unspoken feelings. Catherine's heart pounded. She knew what was happening. They were crossing some invisible line from arrangement into something real, something deeper. And part of her wanted to pull back, to protect herself. But a larger part, the part that was tired of being afraid, wanted to lean forward. Thomas opened his eyes and looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Catherine," he said quietly. I need to tell you something. What? Us, it's not what I expected. He paused, choosing his words carefully. When I sent for a bride, I thought I was getting a practical arrangement. Someone to help with the house. Someone to share the work with. But you're more than that. You've become... He stopped, seeming to struggle. I'm saying this badly. No, Catherine whispered. I think I understand. Do you? Thomas turned to face her fully, taking her hands in his. Because I need you to know, I don't see you as an obligation anymore. I don't see the baby as a burden I agreed to carry. I see you both as mine, as family, as people I want to protect and care for because I care about you, not because I made a promise. End quote. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. Thomas, I'm not asking for anything, he said quickly. I just needed you to know. Needed you to understand that this isn't duty anymore. It's more than that. It's more for me too, Catherine admitted, her voice shaking. I didn't want it to be. I tried not to let it be. But Thomas, I'm falling in love with you, and it terrifies me. The words hung between them, raw and honest. Thomas's eyes widened, then softened. Why does it terrify you? Because I can't survive losing someone else I love. I barely survived it the first time. If I let myself love you completely, and then something happens. Nothing's going to happen, Thomas said firmly. But Catherine shook her head. You can't promise that. Nobody can. People leave. People die. People change their minds. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he stood and pulled Catherine to her feet, wrapping his arms around her carefully, mindful of her belly. She rested her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. You're right, he said finally. I can't promise nothing will happen. Life doesn't work that way. But I can promise that I won't leave by choice. I can promise that I'll fight to stay. And I can promise that every day I wake up, I'll choose you and that baby. Every single day. Catherine closed her eyes, letting his words sink in. It wasn't a guarantee. It wasn't a fairy tale promise of perfect happiness. But it was real. It was honest. And somehow, that made it more valuable than any pretty lie. I'm still scared, she whispered. So am I, Thomas admitted. But maybe we can be scared together. Catherine pulled back enough to look up at him. His face was open, vulnerable, showing her everything he felt. And she realized that he was taking the same risk she was. Opening his heart to someone who might break it, choosing to trust despite the danger. Together, she agreed softly. Thomas cupped her face in his hands and leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. But Catherine didn't pull away. She rose up on her toes, as much as her belly would allow, and met him halfway. The kiss was gentle, tentative, like they were both afraid of breaking something precious. His lips were warm and soft, tasting faintly of coffee. Catherine's hands came up to rest on his chest, feeling his heart pound as fast as her own. When they pulled apart, both were breathing hard. Thomas rested his forehead against hers, his hand still cradling her face. I love you, he said simply. I know it's fast, and I know we've only known each other a few weeks, but I love you, Catherine. The words should have terrified her. Instead, they felt like coming home. I love you too, she whispered back. God help me. I love you too. Thomas kissed her again, deeper this time, his arms wrapping around her carefully. Catherine melted into him, letting herself feel everything she'd been holding back. The love, the hope, the desperate need to be held and cherished. When they finally broke apart, both were smiling. So, Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion, I guess we should probably make this official. Get the Reverend out here for a proper wedding. Catherine laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months. I suppose we should. Nothing fancy. Just us and maybe a few witnesses from town. That sounds perfect. Catherine paused, then added softly, Thank you, Thomas, for giving me this, for giving us this chance. Thank you for taking it, he replied, for being brave enough to stay. They stood there in the fading afternoon light, holding each other, both of them thinking about how close they'd come to missing this. If Catherine had been too afraid to get on that stage, if Thomas had turned her away when he saw she was pregnant, if either of them had let fear win. But they hadn't. They'd chosen courage instead. And now they were here, building something real and good and lasting. The next few weeks passed in a haze of happiness. Reverend Patterson came through and married them properly in the ranch house, with 2 neighbors as witnesses. Catherine wore a simple blue dress she'd sewn herself, and Thomas wore his best shirt and a new vest he'd bought especially for the occasion. The ceremony was short and plain, but when Thomas slipped a simple gold band on her finger and said his vows, Catherine felt tears streaming down her face. With this ring, I thee wed, Thomas said, his voice steady and sure. I promise to love you, honor you, and protect you all the days of my life. You and the child you carry. This is my vow before God and these witnesses. Catherine repeated her own vows, her voice shaking but clear. I promise to love you, honor you, and stand beside you all the days of my life, to be your partner in joy and sorrow. This is my vow. When Reverend Patterson pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed her gently, and Catherine felt something settle in her chest. This was real. This was forever. And for the first time since everything had fallen apart back east, she believed in her own future. The neighbors, the Johnsons from the next ranch over, had brought food, and they all shared a simple wedding supper. Mrs. Johnson was kind, not asking any uncomfortable questions about the baby or the rushed marriage. She just congratulated them warmly and promised to come by when the baby arrived to help however she could. After everyone left, Thomas and Catherine were alone again. The sun had set, and the house was quiet except for the crackling fire. Catherine stood in the middle of the room, suddenly nervous. They were married now, properly married. And she didn't know what Thomas would expect. But Thomas seemed to sense her nervousness. He came to her and took her hands. Nothing changes tonight, unless you want it to, he said quietly. We've got all the time in the world, Catherine. I'm not going to rush you. The relief that washed over her was immense. Thank you, she whispered. Thomas kissed her forehead. How about we just sit by the fire for a while? Like we do most nights? I'd like that. They settled into their usual spots, Catherine in the rocking chair, Thomas in the wooden chair nearby. But after a few minutes, Thomas reached out his hand. Catherine took it, and they sat there in comfortable silence, hands linked, watching the fire dance. Tell me something about yourself I don't know yet, Thomas said eventually. Catherine thought for a moment. I'm afraid of thunderstorms. Have been since I was a child. The thunder makes me jump every time. Thomas smiled. I'll remember that. What else? I love to read. My mother taught me when I was very young, and I've always loved stories. She paused. I miss having books. I only brought 2 with me from Boston. What kind of stories do you like? Adventure stories, travel narratives, anything that takes me somewhere I've never been. Catherine looked at him. What about you? What don't I know? Thomas considered. I'm terrible at singing, but I love music. My mother used to play the piano, and I'd sit and listen to her for hours. His expression turned sad. I wish you could have met her. She'd have loved you. I wish I could have met her too. Catherine squeezed his hand. Tell me about her. And so they talked, sharing memories and stories, learning each other in ways that had nothing to do with practical matters or daily routines. By the time they finally went to their separate rooms, still separate, still giving Catherine space, they knew each other better than many couples married for years. As November arrived and the weather turned colder, Catherine grew larger and more uncomfortable. The baby was active, constantly shifting and kicking. Thomas became more attentive, always ready with a hand to help her up from a chair or an arm to steady her when she walked. One morning, Catherine woke to find the first snow falling. She stood at the window, watching the white flakes drift down, and felt the baby give a particularly strong kick. She gasped and pressed her hand to the spot. Thomas appeared in her doorway immediately. You all right? Yes, just. The baby's very active today. She turned to look at him, and something in her expression must have conveyed her thoughts, because Thomas came to her and wrapped his arms around her from behind, his hands resting on her belly. Not long now, he murmured. Maybe another month or so? The midwife Mrs. Johnson recommended said early to mid-December, based on what I told her. They stood there together, watching the snow fall, Thomas's hands warm on her belly. The baby kicked against his palms, and he laughed softly. Strong little one. Going to be a handful. Probably, Catherine agreed. With my stubbornness and your determination, this child doesn't stand a chance of being easy. Thomas kissed the side of her neck, making her shiver. Wouldn't want easy. Easy's boring. Catherine turned in his arms to face him. They were standing so close, and the look in his eyes made her pulse quicken. Thomas? Yes? She lead more der supposed me once bless, så hast around her. Like he mentioned this dry, the where there are not her him. They're my place where a lost allows white. Yes? Cone let dranding attention out in him. Clow fell minded then, all the crime planned or spoons the twice. I think I'm ready. For us to really be married. Thomas's breath caught. Catherine, you don't have to. I know I don't have to, but I want to. She reached up and touched his face. I love you. I trust you. And I want to be your wife in every way. Thomas searched her eyes, making sure she meant it. Then he leaned down and kissed her, deep and thorough, pouring everything he felt into it. When they broke apart, both were breathless. Are you sure? He asked one more time. I'm sure. That night, Thomas moved his things into her room. They lay together in the bed he'd built, wrapped in each other's arms, and Catherine felt a peace she'd never known before. Thomas was gentle and patient, mindful of her condition, and when he held her afterward, she felt cherished and safe and loved. "I love you," he whispered into her hair. "I love you too," Catherine whispered back, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. The weeks that followed were some of the happiest of Catherine's life. She and Thomas settled into married life with an ease that surprised them both. They worked together, ate together, slept together, and talked about everything. Thomas read aloud to her in the evenings from her books, his deep voice making even familiar stories feel new. Catherine taught him how to knit, laughing as his large, calloused hands fumbled with the needles, but persevered until he managed a lumpy baby blanket. But underneath the happiness, anxiety grew as Catherine's due date approached. She'd heard stories from other women about childbirth, how painful it was, how dangerous, how many women didn't survive it. And she was terrified. One night in early December, she woke from a nightmare about the birth, her heart pounding, sweat dampening her nightgown despite the cold. Thomas stirred beside her. "Catherine? What's wrong?" "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I'm so scared, Thomas. What if something goes wrong? What if I can't do this? What if—" Hey. Thomas pulled her against his chest, one hand stroking her hair. "Nothing's going to go wrong. Mrs. Johnson said the midwife is good, and I'll be right there with you. You can't be in the room during the birth. Men aren't allowed. Then I'll be right outside that door. And the second it's over, I'll be there. You're not going through this alone." Catherine pressed her face against his chest, breathing in his familiar scent of leather and sage. "I'm afraid of dying. I'm afraid of leaving you alone, of this baby growing up without me. You're not going to die," Thomas said fiercely. "You're strong, Catherine, stronger than you know. You're going to get through this, and then we're going to raise this baby together. You, me, and that stubborn little one who kicks like a mule." Despite her fear, Catherine smiled. "You really think so?" "I know so." Thomas tilted her face up to his. "I love you, and I need you to believe you're going to be fine. Because you are. You hear me?" "I hear you," Catherine whispered. He kissed her then, gentle and reassuring, and Catherine let herself believe him. She had to believe him, because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. 2 days later, on a cold December morning with fresh snow on the ground, Catherine's water broke. She was standing in the kitchen, and suddenly there was warmth between her legs and wetness soaking her dress. For a moment, she just stood there, frozen. "Thomas," she called, her voice higher than normal. He came running from the barn, bursting through the door with panic on his face. "What? What's wrong?" "The baby," Catherine said, clutching the table. "It's coming. My water just broke." Thomas went pale, but snapped into action. All right. I'll get Mrs. Johnson. She'll fetch the midwife. You sit down. Don't move." "Thomas, I'm not going to." Catherine started, but then a contraction hit, stealing her breath. It wasn't terribly painful yet, just a tightening that made her gasp, but it was enough to make her sink into the chair. Thomas grabbed his coat and hat. I'll be back as fast as I can. Don't. Just stay there. I'm not going anywhere, Catherine managed, and Thomas ran out the door. Alone, Catherine tried to calm her racing heart. This was it. The baby was coming. She was about to become a mother. And she was absolutely terrified. But she thought about Thomas's words. You're strong, Catherine. Stronger than you know. And she thought about how far she'd come. From being cast out of her father's house in shame to here, married to a good man, about to bring a child into a home filled with love instead of judgment. She could do this. She would do this. Thomas returned less than 30 minutes later with Mrs. Johnson, who took one look at Catherine and took charge. All right, dear. Let's get you into the bedroom. Thomas, you boil water and then stay out here. This is women's work. But Thomas looked at Catherine with desperate eyes. I'll be all right, Catherine told him, trying to sound braver than she felt. Just stay close. I'm not leaving this house, Thomas promised. Not for a second. Mrs. Johnson helped Catherine into the bedroom and got her settled on the bed. The contractions were coming stronger now, about 10 minutes apart. Each one made Catherine grit her teeth and grip the bed frame. How long? She gasped between contractions. Could be hours, could be quicker. First babies are usually slow. Mrs. Johnson patted her hand. But you're young and strong. You'll do fine. The midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Fletcher, arrived about an hour later. By then, Catherine was in real pain. The contractions coming every 5 minutes and lasting longer. She could hear Thomas pacing in the main room, could occasionally hear his voice asking Mrs. Johnson if Catherine was all right. That man loves you something fierce, Mrs. Fletcher observed as she examined Catherine. Not many men would be this worried about a wife they've only known a few months. He's a good man, Catherine panted. The best man I've ever known. Well, you picked right then. Or he picked right. Either way. Mrs. Fletcher straightened. You're progressing well. Won't be too long now. But not too long turned into hours. The sun set, and still the baby didn't come. Catherine labored through the evening and into the night, the pain becoming so intense she could barely think. Mrs. Johnson wiped her forehead with cool cloths. Mrs. Fletcher coached her through each contraction, and outside the door, Thomas wore a path in the floorboards with his pacing. Sometime around midnight, Catherine started to lose hope. She was exhausted. The pain was overwhelming, and the baby still wasn't coming. Tears streamed down her face. I can't, she sobbed. I can't do this anymore. It hurts too much. Yes, you can, Mrs. Fletcher said firmly. You're almost there, Catherine. Just a little longer. Thomas, Catherine called out weakly. I need Thomas. Mrs. Johnson looked at Mrs. Fletcher, who sighed and nodded. All right. Let him in. Might give her the strength she needs. Mrs. Johnson opened the door. Thomas, she's asking for you. Thomas was through the door in an instant. He looked terrible, pale, exhausted, terrified. But when he saw Catherine, his face crumpled with relief and fear combined. Catherine. He was at her side immediately, taking her hand. I'm here. I'm right here. I'm sorry, Catherine gasped. I'm trying, but I can't. It hurts. You can, Thomas said, gripping her hand tight. You're the bravest person I know, Catherine. You can do this. I know you can. The next contraction hit, and Catherine screamed, squeezing Thomas's hand so hard she thought she might break it. But he didn't pull away. He stayed right there, his other hand stroking her hair, murmuring encouragement. "That's it," Mrs. Fletcher said. "I can see the head. One more big push, Catherine. One more." Catherine bore down with everything she had, feeling like she was being torn apart. Thomas held her hand and whispered, "I love you. I love you. I love you," over and over like a prayer. And then, suddenly, there was a release of pressure, and a thin, angry wail filled the room. "It's a boy," Mrs. Fletcher announced. "A healthy baby boy." Catherine collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted but overwhelmed with relief. Thomas was crying openly, staring at the tiny, squalling infant Mrs. Fletcher was cleaning. "A boy," he whispered. "Catherine, we have a son." Mrs. Fletcher wrapped the baby in a soft blanket and placed him in Catherine's arms. He was red-faced and furious, his tiny fists waving, dark hair plastered to his head. And he was absolutely perfect. "Hello, little one," Catherine whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Hello, sweetheart. We've been waiting for you." The baby's cries quieted as he heard her voice. His eyes, dark blue and unfocused, seemed to search for her. Thomas leaned over them both, one finger gently touching the baby's tiny hand. The baby's fingers immediately wrapped around Thomas's finger and held tight. Thomas made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "He's perfect, Catherine. He's absolutely perfect." "He is," Catherine agreed, unable to look away from her son's face. "He really is." Mrs. Fletcher finished her work and left them alone with the baby, promising to check back in the morning. Mrs. Johnson gave them privacy as well, settling herself in the main room to sleep. Thomas carefully climbed onto the bed beside Catherine, wrapping his arm around her shoulders so they could both look at their son together. "What should we name him?" Catherine asked softly. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Would you mind if we called him Henry? After my brother?" Catherine looked up at him and saw the hope and grief mixed in his expression. "Henry Brennan," she said, trying it out. "I think that's perfect." "Henry Thomas Brennan," Thomas added. "If that's all right with you?" Catherine smiled. "Henry Thomas Brennan. Yes, that's exactly right." They sat there, in the quiet darkness, watching their son sleep, both of them overwhelmed with love and gratitude and relief. Henry, their son, their family. "Thank you," Thomas whispered after a while. "For what?" "For trusting me, for staying, for giving me this." He kissed the top of her head. "For being brave enough to get on that stage and come here, even though you were terrified." Catherine looked up at him. "Thank you for saying yes. For looking at me that first day and seeing past everything. For loving me when I was sure no one ever would again." "How could I not love you?" Thomas asked simply. "You're everything, Catherine. Everything I didn't know I needed." Catherine reached up and kissed him, long and sweet, the baby sleeping peacefully between them. When they pulled apart, both were smiling. "We did it," Catherine said. "We actually did it." "We did," Thomas agreed. "And we're going to keep doing it, one day at a time, together. The next few days passed in a haze of exhaustion and wonder. Henry proved to be a hungry baby, waking every few hours to nurse. Catherine was sore and tired. But every time she looked at her son's tiny face, every time his little fingers wrapped around hers, she felt a surge of love so powerful it took her breath away. Thomas was extraordinary. He changed diapers without complaint, walked the floor with Henry when Catherine needed to sleep, brought her food and water, and never once seemed bothered by the constant demands of a newborn. He'd look at Henry with such wonder and fierce protectiveness that Catherine's heart would squeeze. "You're a natural at this," she told him one morning as she watched him rock Henry gently. Thomas glanced up with a tired smile. "I'm terrified I'll drop him or do something wrong. But I love him so much already. I didn't know I could feel this way." "Neither did I," Catherine admitted. She'd been afraid that she wouldn't love the baby properly, that her circumstances would taint her feelings. But the moment Henry was placed in her arms, all those fears had vanished. He was hers. He was Thomas's. He was theirs. Mrs. Johnson stopped by regularly those first few days, bringing food and checking on Catherine's recovery. On the third day, she arrived with a basket of supplies and news from town. "Mrs. Hartwell was asking after you both," she said carefully as she unpacked bread and stew. "Wanted to know if the baby had come." Catherine tensed. "What did you tell her?" "Told her you had a healthy baby boy, and that both mother and child were doing well." Mrs. Johnson's expression was kind but firm. "Catherine, I know what people say. I know there's gossip about how quickly you married and how soon the baby came. But I want you to know, some of us don't care about that. What matters is that you're both good people, doing your best." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you. That means more than you know. You just focus on that baby and that good man of yours. Let the gossips talk themselves tired. Eventually they'll find someone else to whisper about." Mrs. Johnson patted Catherine's hand. "And for what it's worth, I think Thomas chose well. You're strong, Catherine. You'll make a good life here." After Mrs. Johnson left, Catherine told Thomas what she'd said. He was sitting in the rocking chair with Henry asleep on his chest, one large hand cradling the baby's tiny head. "She's right," Thomas said. "The gossip doesn't matter. Let them talk. We know the truth, that we love each other and this baby. That's all that counts." Catherine moved to sit on the arm of the rocking chair, resting her head on Thomas's shoulder. Together they looked at Henry, at his perfect tiny features, his rosebud mouth, the way his little chest rose and fell with each breath. "I can't believe he's ours," Catherine whispered. "Sometimes I look at him and can't believe we made this perfect little person." "We're going to give him a good life," Thomas said firmly. "He's going to grow up knowing he's loved and wanted. He's never going to question his place in this family." Catherine understood what Thomas was promising, that Henry would never know he wasn't Thomas's biological son, that no one would ever make him feel less than fully theirs. "Thank you," she said softly, "for loving him like he's yours." Thomas looked at her seriously. "Catherine, he is mine. From the moment you told me you were carrying him, he became mine. Blood doesn't make a father. Love does. And I love this boy with everything I have." The certainty in his voice made Catherine's throat tight. She'd been so afraid that Thomas would change his mind, that he'd hold Henry at arm's length or treat him differently. but she should have known better. Thomas Brennan didn't make promises he didn't keep. "I love you," she told him, cupping his face and kissing him gently. "I love you so much. I love you too, both of you." Thomas shifted carefully so Henry stayed asleep. "Now, you should rest while he's sleeping. Go lie down." "I'm fine." "Catherine." Thomas gave her a look. "You just had a baby 3 days ago. You need rest. Go." Catherine smiled and obeyed, heading to the bedroom. But before she lay down, she paused in the doorway and looked back. Thomas was still in the rocking chair, Henry on his chest, both of them peaceful and content. The morning sun streamed through the window, painting them both in warm gold light. And Catherine felt her heart swell with so much love and gratitude, she thought it might burst. This was her family, her home, her future. And it was more than she'd ever dared to dream. By the end of the week, Catherine was feeling stronger. The soreness had eased, and she'd found a rhythm with Henry's feedings and sleep schedule. Thomas had finished the cradle he'd been building and placed it beside their bed, lined with soft blankets. Every night, Henry slept within arm's reach, and Catherine would wake sometimes just to watch him breathe. On Sunday morning, Thomas suggested they take a short walk outside, just around the yard. The fresh air will do you both good. Catherine bundled Henry warmly and let Thomas help her into her shawl. They stepped out onto the porch together, and Catherine took a deep breath of the cold December air. Snow covered everything in soft white, and the sun sparkled on it like diamonds. "It's beautiful," she said softly. Thomas wrapped his arm around her waist, careful of how she was still recovering. "It is. This is going to be Henry's first memory of the world. This ranch, this snow, this peace." Catherine looked up at him. "You really think we're going to be all right, don't you? All three of us?" "I know we are," Thomas said with complete confidence. He looked down at Henry, sleeping peacefully in Catherine's arms. "This boy is going to grow up strong and happy and loved. He's going to help me with the ranch when he's old enough. He's going to learn to ride and rope and be a good man." He paused, then added, "And maybe he'll have brothers and sisters someday, if you want more children." Catherine felt her breath catch. She'd been so focused on getting through Henry's birth that she hadn't thought about future babies. But the idea didn't frighten her now. "I think I'd like that," she said softly. "Not right away, but someday." Thomas smiled and kissed her temple. "Someday. We've got all the time in the world." They stood there together on the porch, the three of them, watching the sun climb higher in the morning sky. Catherine thought about how far she'd come, from that terrified woman stepping off the stagecoach with a secret and no hope, to this moment, standing beside the man she loved, holding their son, with a future stretching bright before them. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For being exactly who you are. For giving me a second chance. For loving me when I didn't think I deserved it." Thomas turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "Catherine, you always deserved it. You always deserved love and kindness and a home. You just needed someone to see it." He touched her face gently. "I'm the lucky one. You came into my life and filled all the empty spaces I didn't even know were there." Catherine kissed him, soft and sweet, while Henry slept between them. When they pulled apart, both were smiling. "Come on," Thomas said. "Let's get you both back inside where it's warm. But tonight, after Henry's asleep, I'll make us a nice supper. We should celebrate our first week as a family." "That sounds perfect." That evening, true to his word, Thomas cooked a simple but delicious meal. They ate together at their table, Henry sleeping in his cradle nearby, and talked about their plans for the spring. What they'd plant in the garden, whether to expand the herd, all the ordinary dreams that made up a life. After supper, as they sat by the fire with the dishes washed, and Henry fed and sleeping, Catherine felt a contentment so complete it brought tears to her eyes. "What is it?" Thomas asked, noticing. "I'm just happy," Catherine said simply. "For the first time in over a year, I'm truly happy. I have you, I have Henry, I have a home, I have everything I need." Thomas pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder. "So do I," he said quietly. "So do I." Outside, the December wind whispered across the prairie, and the stars glittered cold and distant in the night sky. But inside the small ranch house, warmth and love surrounded a family that had been built not from convenience or tradition, but from courage, forgiveness, and the willingness to take a chance on something real. Catherine closed her eyes, listening to Thomas's heartbeat and Henry's soft breathing, and knew with absolute certainty that she was home.